is a midweek episode of the Sunday Stoic. I'm about to go on vacation. I've recorded a few that should release on Sunday and everything, so don't fret there. But I'm off work right now. It's summer. I just finished teaching. It's hot outside. I feel guilty sitting around doing nothing, but I am reviewing some philosophy. And I'm taking to heart what Seneca says, that truth belongs to no man. Basically, if you find truth, even in schools that the Stoics didn't agree with on most things, if you find something, let's say from Epicurus, that really speaks to you, you should go with it, or use it, or examine it. And I find that when I'm studying this stuff, I'm walking a line. I'm trying to let philosophy change me without me changing philosophy, meaning I don't want to just scrap a bunch of things in, let's just say, Stoicism, because I'm not quite sure about it. I want it to have a chance to change me, but I'm also not a fan of dogmatic belief in things. So I'm not going to buy Stoicism top to bottom just because Epictetus said so, right? And I've been reading a little bit of Epicurus, so just to put it in, now my knowledge is an inch deep and not even a mile wide, so bear with me if you know more than I'm learning, right? But Epicurus would say pleasure is the ultimate goal for a happy life. And I'm not talking about like crazy hedonistic pleasure. We're talking more about an absence of pain and intellectual pleasure and just eating a basic healthy diet and having good friends. So there's a lot of things here that are externals from the Stoic perspective. And virtue helps you to get these pleasures, right? But the Stoics say virtue is the ultimate goal, and any kind of good pleasure that comes along for the ride is secondary to virtue. So these are kind of a major point of contention between the two schools. And then there's Aristotle. Excuse me. Aristotle, and once again, I'm not an expert on this, but Aristotle said that virtue is super important. It's like the top thing here, but also there are some externals that you need to keep in mind. Things like good looks, which obviously I'm screwed then, but certain externals are necessary. Food, shelter, water. These things are necessary to have a good, flourishing life. Eudaimonia, I think, is the word for it. This idea of a fully lived, happy, flourishing, good life. So we have lots of different schools with different ideas and a lot of overlapping ideas. Like there's a lot of overlap between Epicurus and Stoicism, but there is a lot of things that they would fight about as well, because their fundamental view, one being that pleasure being the ultimate good, one being that virtue is the ultimate good. And so you have infighting because of those different viewpoints. So my own current viewpoint, from my own perspective, is kind of eclectic. I'm kind of an eclectic philosopher. I would say Stoicism is at the core. And I'm still learning about Stoicism and about other things. But Stoicism being at the core, here's how I would put my own perspective. The supreme good is virtue. This top tier of goodness, supreme good, virtue. And that is all you need to live a good life. So that I get from the Stoics, right? So the good life, a contented life, that's all you need, which is a very powerful thing. So if you are rich or poor, you can have a good life. If you're in prison, you can have a good life. But I would add another layer there, maybe just on my deathbed saying, yeah, I had a good life. Well, that's one thing, but what about a life of flourishing, a life of fullness and something beyond just it was good? Is there something better than good? Well, that's up for argument, and I am not a bona fide philosopher, but something beyond a content life. And I would say that would be the flourishing life, something beyond the kind of life I could live if I were on death row. But aren't we all on death row? So how can we get the best out of life on our way out? And that's where I would classify things that the Stoics call indifferents. I would call sub-goods. So the supreme good being virtue, which is all you need to live a worthwhile life. But let's say you want to spice it up a little bit, okay? What's the spice of life? And that would be the sub-goods. And these are things like family, friends, food, shelter, health, etc. Now, I would argue that some of these, let's step into Epicureanism for a minute, are necessary desires and natural. They're natural, necessary desires. We are human beings that have evolved to live on this planet. I'm a biologist, so that's what I do, right? I study this stuff. So there's diversity in life, even in some of the earliest life. However it started on this planet, there would have been some genetic diversity over time due to errors in the copying of DNA. Those little errors lead to variation. And those bits of variation that work really well accumulate more and more each generation because the critters with that variant have more babies. But of course, those babies have their own little mutations, and they have their own diversity, and those mutations accumulate. The things that work well build up and get concentrated generation after generation. And that leads to where we are now. We're still part of this process. We're not the end point of evolution by any means, but here we are. We have evolved. Of course, we need water. That's necessary. We need food. Without it, your good life is a very short one. So I would say those are worthwhile things to pursue, even if they are kind of out of your control. We can pursue them, but pursue them virtuously. Family and friends. We are social beings. We've evolved to be social beings. We can't live as hermits very well. A few of us can pull it off, but not many of us. It's part of our DNA. It's living according to nature to have a family, to have friends. Now, these are preferred indifferents, right? Or as I would maybe call them, sub-goods. I think of my child as extremely good, right? My wife and child are very important to me. I could not just suffer their loss and go, well, they're mortal. It was going to happen. It would take some time to get over their loss, and I never would get over their loss, really. And I work for them every day. These are goods in my life, not just indifference to me. But there are distant family members that I can't control, and I can't control my own child. Things about my child, my wife, my house, and things like that are indifferent. I can't control them. I can't get mad when things don't go my way. So we have to, from my perspective, I have to combine a few of these philosophies. But I'm trying to be careful to let philosophy change me, not to just say, well, I don't agree with this philosophy. I think pleasure is great. Therefore, I am a hedonist, or therefore I'm an Epicurean, or whatever. To me, it's not about what am I, pick a philosophy. It's what philosophy embodies what I want to become, and then work on it. So I would never advocate picking a philosophy because it's what you do already. Parts of it you might do already, but pick a philosophy that embodies what you want to be. And to me, Stoicism is the core of that, but I'm eclectically adding on a few things from other philosophies. So family, friends, food, shelter, I would call those sub-goods rather than indifference to my own life. These are things I will pursue, but I know that their loss is going to occur, that they will never do exactly what I want. You know, my job will never be exactly the way I want it. My child will never behave the exact way I want. I may lose family to whatever, petty jealousy or on their part, hopefully not on my part, and other, death, things like that. And I have to acknowledge that will happen and not be so devastated by it as to not live a good, happy life. So we will lose these subgoods. Their loss and their control is not in our hands. So there are natural, necessary desires, things we are evolved by nature to desire, not just to be, indifferent to, from my perspective. And as Epicurus would say, there are unnecessary natural desires, or unnecessary desires as well, which the Stoics would mostly agree with, I think, like fame and fortune and things that we don't need to devote our lives to. So really, it may just be a matter of semantics. It's just wording. Something that's, I think, is a good thing to have in my life that's not under my direct control, like my wife and child and food, versus an indifferent. You can be a moral person while starving to death, and I have no doubt about that. But I would prefer not to starve to death, and I would consider it a good to feed my child and to give him shelter. It may not be the supreme good, but it is something that I would bust my butt for to accomplish. And so, tying this then to Aristotle has this huge list of virtues well beyond that of the Stoics, and Aristotle thought that a lot of these externals were important for living a flourishing life. I think maybe they're not necessary, but they're helpful for a flourishing life, like wealth and things like that. But just to run down a list of Aristotle's virtues: bravery, temperance, generosity, truthfulness, being witty, friendliness, being spirited, conscientious, benevolent, industrious, things like that. And he acknowledged that there were extremes on both sides of these virtues. For example, it's a vice to be cowardly. It's a vice to be rash, but it's a virtue to be brave. It's a vice to be addicted or to live like a hermit, basically, but being temperate is a virtue. Being stingy or extravagant are vices, but being generous is a virtue. So he has this idea of the golden mean, which I think of as just like temperance, basically. We're walking the line between extravagance and destitution. And that's something worth thinking about as well. I like little pieces of these other philosophies. But at the beating heart is this idea of Stoicism. Regardless of our external circumstances, we can still be a good person. And that's where virtue comes in. Now, moving out to externals, family, friends, food, things like these. These are very important things. These are preferred indifferents in Stoic terms, or as I would call them, subgoods. The supreme good being virtue, subgoods being other things worth pursuing, not just sitting around and not caring if they come or not, but worth pursuing, but not hanging all of your happiness on. Some of them will slip through your fingers or break your heart if you let them, and let them slip away and say, well, that didn't work out. Be stoic about it. Anyway, that is my perspective where I am right now in this philosophy. This is a bit rambly, obviously unscripted, as are all of my podcasts. But I just thought I'd share what I was thinking today. Anyway, have a great week. I'm going fishing.